Okay, here are a couple of responses to the challenging introduction that we were given on postmortem privacy. And the issue that I want to focus on is who is the beneficiary from postmortem privacy? Who is the subject of postmortem privacy? Who do we want to protect through it? And the way the text and Lillian frames it is, I think, a very common one. It is primarily protecting the deceased. And then we are getting into considerable philosophical, theological, conceptual questions if it makes sense to attribute rights to an entity that at that point at least doesn't have interest any longer. Very quickly we see then a potential conflict emerging with the relatives, their interest, their desire to make use of the material as they see fit, but also potentially a need to protect the relatives, that it is their dignity interest that to a certain degree give indirect protection to data about the deceased simply because it would inflict emotional harm and distress on them if the material is too widely used. So these are the two options, I think, that we find typically in the literature. Either the deceased or the relatives, and potentially also a conflict between the two. And what I'm going to argue is that these answers might be wrong, or at least only partially true, and might get us in the way of a more comprehensive appreciation of the case for postmortem privacy. In order to make this case, I want to invite you first to a crime scene, a terrible crime scene, one of the greatest crimes in history, as some people said. And the victim, possibly, of that crime was this man, Alfred Lord Byron, famously mad, bad, and dangerous to know. He had written his memoirs. He had instructed his friends to publish them after his death. Even he apparently thought that they were slightly too explosive to be published while he was still alive. Unfortunately, his intentions were thwarted by their friends because in 1824, as it is probably well known for you, after a considerable amount of quarreling, debate, argument between them, they finally decided that it would be too traumatic for his widow and his child to have this work published, and they immediately burned it and destroyed it. That was what is sometimes called the greatest crime in literary history. So here we have someone who would quite like to have a version of his memory made public, as intrusive it might have been to third parties, but it is the administrators of the estate that decide that that is not really appropriate. We have two other examples, slightly different scenarios. Philip Larkin, he wanted his letters, his diary destroyed, and he was successful in doing that, at least largely successful. One of his mistresses managed to get hold of the material and put it into a shredder. And then finally, probably most important for what I want to argue, Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens, shortly before his death, destroyed 10,000 discrete pieces of writing, typically letters, diary entries, and so on and so forth. And he wrote about it. They sent up a smoke like the genie when he got out of the casket on the seashore. And it was an exquisite day when I began, and it rained very heavily when I finished. I suspect my correspondence of having overcast the face of heavens. And he gives this explanation as justification explicitly that he was shocked by the misuse of private letters of public men. There's been significant speculation which letters in particular he wanted to protect, potentially evidence of an affair he had or did not have. He was concerned about the reputation of a woman he had social contact with. So in order to protect her, he made the decision to destroy it all, probably because it would have been too cumbersome, too difficult to individually select those pieces that would have allowed others to identify her for what she is. And that's one of the problems I think we have with significant bodies of writing, letter correspondence, diaries. It could be that very, very small pieces joined together allow the next generation to find out things about you that you would rather keep secret, and therefore the only way currently is to destroy it all. And again, both in the case of Larkin and in the case of Dickens, and also in different ways in the case of Byron, I think harm was realized, harm was inflicted on the subsequent generations, something that would have been really important for us to know, interesting for us to know. Getting a better idea of what made these great writers think is lost forever. Probably not, well, obviously in the case of Byron, not at all, but also in the case of Dickens, not something that in an ideal world they would have chosen. They act out of self-defense, they act because this is the only way they see to protect their legacy and potentially also some of their relatives. So whether or not we enjoy certain rights after our death has an impact on what we do now, how we dispose of our letters, of our diaries. And there are other examples throughout history where either scientists, writers, artists destroyed their own diaries, their own letters, or very concerned relatives immediately after their death did it for them. In all of these cases, subsequent generations were deprived of something that could have been quite important for them. So for me, that question is also one of intergenerational equity. Could we not make a different deal between our generation and the future generation that enables us to be more confident in preserving some of the information about us, because we know that there's at least a degree of constraint or restraint on the next generation on how to use it. There's a degree of privacy that will be in place, regardless of potentially even the wishes of the relatives. Death is in that sense also a radical form of context collapse. We all know from the privacy discussion that we very carefully construct different IDs for us in different online communities. At the point of death, these collapse because all the data is now held in one hand, potentially that of the administrator of the estate or heirs. That too is something that we will often find concerning, because while we are happy to have this data in principle out there, we do not want it to be combined. So what can we do here? I think what we need is a sort of federated or decentralized solution, potentially with a degree of technological support that allows us to select more carefully which of the information about us we are happy to get preserved, which one we are happy to be preserved, provided that it remains in silos, and which ones are going to be not preserved at all. And that, together with a degree of postmortem privacy, should allow us to be more confident, maybe having a 20-year grace period as a possibility to keep something in a digital log and then only release it bit by bit, as a deal, as a compromise, that allows me to optimize my behavior now with the interest of subsequent generations. Whereas what we are doing now is to force people potentially in destructive behavior that over-destroys, that is not selective enough, simply because this is the only way they think they can construct their understanding of themselves for past generations, for next generations.